The biting wind of a Birmingham Saturday morning whipped around the Children's Medical Center, a stark contrast to the sterile warmth inside. A small figure, hunched against the brick wall, seemed oblivious to the chill. 9-year-old Ezekiel Carter, known as Zeke, meticulously shaded the lines of a sketchpad, his brow furrowed in concentration. The drawing of Phoenix rising from ashes seemed to mirror the flicker of hope he carried within him. He'd seen that flicker in other eyes, dimmed by pain and despair, and he knew he could rekindle it. The heavy automatic doors hissed open, disgorging a man and a small girl into the biting air. Jonathan Reeves clutched his daughter's wheelchair, the metal cold against his palms. Isa, a frail 6-year-old, sat nestled in a blanket, her eyes fixed on the passing clouds, a stark stillness in her posture. Every time they left this building, the weight of her paralysis pressed down on Jonathan like a physical burden. Another week, another appointment, another dose of professional sympathy that did nothing to ease the gnawing emptiness in his soul. He pushed the chair with a mechanical rhythm, his gaze fixed on the cracked pavement, each fissure a reflection of the fractures in his own life. Another Saturday wasted. Another week closer to what? He couldn't bring himself to complete the thought. The future stretched before him, a desolate landscape devoid of the laughter and boundless energy that had once filled their home. Zeke's gaze shifted from his drawing to the pair. He'd been observing them for weeks, the silent despair radiating from the man, the quiet resignation in the child's eyes. He recognized it. He'd seen it in his mother's eyes before he swallowed the lump in his throat, the familiar ache, a constant companion. He knew what he had to do. He closed his sketchbook, the Phoenix now hidden from view, its image burned onto his mind. He stood up, his small frame dwarfed by the imposing hospital building. Taking a deep breath, he approached the man and the child, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Sir," he began, his voice barely a whisper against the wind, "I can make your daughter walk again." The words hung in the air, fragile yet resonant. Jonathan stopped abruptly, the wheelchair's momentum almost causing it to jolt forward. He turned, his eyes narrowed against the glare of the sun, trying to focus on the small figure before him. His mind, still lost in the labyrinth of grief and exhaustion, struggled to process the words. Walk again? Did I hear that right? The absurdity of the statement, coupled with the boy's earnest expression, created a strange dissonance in his mind. He looked down at Isa, her pale face framed by dark curls, her gaze still fixed on the distant sky. Could this be some cruel joke? Some twisted form of street theater preying on the desperation of grieving parents? What did you just say? Jonathan's voice was rough, edged with suspicion and a flicker of something akin to desperate hope he dared not acknowledge. Zeke stood his ground, his small hands clenched at his sides. He met Jonathan's gaze, the intensity in his eyes belying his age. "I can help her, sir. I know I can." Jonathan studied the boy, his mind racing. He saw no guile in those dark, serious eyes, only an unwavering conviction that bordered on the uncanny. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a spark of possibility. But it was quickly extinguished by the weight of his reality. This is ridiculous. A 9-year-old boy? He's probably just trying to sell me something. He started to turn away, to dismiss the boy and retreat back into the familiar comfort of his despair. Ow! The word escaped his lips before he could stop it. He hated himself for even entertaining the idea, for allowing this sliver of hope to pierce the protective shell of his grief. Zeke took a step closer, his voice gaining a newfound strength. "My mother taught me. She helped people. And now I can too." He paused, a shadow passing over his young face. He rarely spoke about his mother. The wound of her absence was still too fresh. Jonathan watched the boy, his skepticism warring with a desperate yearning. The mention of the boy's mother stirred something within him, a recognition of shared loss. Taught him? What could a child possibly know about healing like this? He glanced at Isa, her small hand resting limply on the blanket. He pictured her running through the park, her laughter echoing through the trees, the image a painful reminder of what he had lost. He clenched his jaw, fighting back the familiar wave of despair. Don't be a fool, Jonathan. There's no miracle cure. But despite his internal warnings, he couldn't bring himself to dismiss the boy completely. There was something in Zeke's gaze, a quiet strength that resonated with a part of him he thought had died, along with Isa's ability to walk. A part of him, buried deep beneath layers of grief and cynicism, whispered that maybe, just maybe, this boy held the key to unlocking the prison of his daughter's paralysis. The hum of the car engine was a low, monotonous drone against the backdrop of Jonathan's turbulent thoughts. Zeke, perched in the back seat, small and impossibly still, seemed oblivious to the storm raging within the man beside him. Jonathan gripped the steering wheel, knuckles bone-white. The boy's words, so audacious, so ludicrous, echoed in the hollow chambers of his grief. "I can make your daughter walk again." He glanced at the rearview mirror, catching Zeke's unwavering gaze. Those dark, intelligent eyes held an unsettling maturity, a depth that belied his age. Jonathan looked away, dismissing it as childish fantasy. He'd heard enough empty promises from specialists, therapists, even well-meaning friends. What could a 9-year-old boy possibly offer that medical science couldn't? Hope was a cruel phantom, a fleeting mirage in the desolate landscape of his reality. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the hospital corridors, a familiar aroma that now tasted of despair. Isa's small hand, limp in his, felt fragile, like the wing of a broken bird. He squeezed gently, trying to convey a reassurance he himself didn't feel. The doctor's words, delivered with professional detachment, were a repetition of the same grim prognosis. Nerve damage. Irreversible. He saw Isa's face, carefully blank, a shield against the unspoken fear in her eyes. Jonathan felt a familiar pang of helplessness, a crushing weight in his chest. He forced a smile, a hollow gesture meant to comfort, but the lie tasted like ash in his mouth. Throughout the day, the image of Zeke's solemn face kept intruding upon his thoughts. The boy's unwavering conviction, so out of place in the clinical setting of the hospital, gnawed at the edges of his disbelief. Jonathan found himself replaying their brief conversation, searching for a crack in the boy's facade, a hint of fabrication. He found none. "I wasn't joking," Zeke had said, his voice quiet yet firm, the words hanging in the air like a stubborn echo. Jonathan recalled the strange intensity in the boy's eyes, the unsettling certainty in his tone. It was absurd, irrational, yet a tiny, unwelcome seed of doubt had been planted. He watched Isa as she underwent her physiotherapy, her small body struggling against the limitations imposed by her paralysis. Her quiet stoicism, her brave attempts to comply with the therapist's instructions, twisted a knife in Jonathan's gut. He knew she understood, on some level, the gravity of her situation, the slim chances of a full recovery. The unspoken fear in her eyes mirrored his own. He clenched his fists, the frustration simmering beneath the surface. He wanted to rage, to scream, to shake the heavens and demand answers. Why his daughter? Why this cruel fate? But the only sound he made was a choked sigh, a whisper of despair lost in the sterile hum of the hospital. The drive home was a blur. The city lights seemed to mock him with their vibrant energy, their relentless motion, a stark contrast to the stillness that had enveloped his life. He pulled into the driveway, the familiar surroundings suddenly alien, a reminder of a life that no longer existed. He turned off the engine, the silence amplifying the turmoil within him. Zeke's words, dismissed earlier as childish naivety, now resonated with a strange, unsettling power. "I can make your daughter walk again." The boy's quiet confidence, his unwavering gaze, haunted him. He rested his forehead against the steering wheel, the cool leather a soothing touch against his burning skin. He knew it was foolish, irrational, a desperate grasp at straws. Yet, he couldn't shake the boy's words from his mind. The doctors, with their clinical pronouncements, their detached professionalism, offered no solace, only cold, hard facts. Zeke, on the other hand, offered something intangible, something that defied logic and reason: hope. A fragile, flickering flame in the overwhelming darkness. Jonathan closed his eyes, the image of Zeke's face superimposed over Isa's struggling form. He saw the boy's small hands, his intense gaze, and heard again his quiet, resolute voice. "I can make your daughter walk again." The words, once dismissed as a child's fantasy, now echoed in his mind with a strange, compelling resonance. He thought of his wife, Eleanor, her quiet grief mirroring his own, their shared despair a heavy shroud suffocating their home. He thought of Isa, her forced smiles, her brave attempts to maintain a semblance of normalcy. He thought of the hollow ache in his chest, the constant, gnawing fear that this was their new reality, a life sentence of limitations and unspoken sorrow. And then, against all reason, against all logic, a flicker of something akin to hope ignited within him. It was a fragile ember, easily extinguished, yet it burned with a surprising intensity. He opened his eyes, the streetlights blurring through the windshield, a distorted reflection of his own fragmented thoughts. He knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that he had to see the boy again. He had to know, had to understand the source of that unwavering conviction, that strange, unsettling certainty. He had to know, even if it meant facing the crushing disappointment that awaited him, if Zeke's words proved to be nothing more than a child's empty boast. He had to know, because in the desolate landscape of his grief, even the faintest glimmer of hope was a lifeline he couldn't afford to ignore. The automatic doors of Children's Medical Center hissed open, releasing Jonathan and Isa into the humid Birmingham afternoon. Sunlight, thick and heavy, pressed down on Jonathan's shoulders, a palpable weight mirroring the one in his chest. Isa, nestled in her specialized wheelchair, remained pale and quiet, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. He pushed her chair, the rhythmic squeak of the wheels a constant reminder of her limitations, of his failures. Each rotation felt like a small, sharp twist of the knife lodged deep within his soul. Another week, he thought, the words echoing the hollow ache in his gut. Another week of therapy, another week of false hope, another week closer to accepting that this is it. He caught a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision, a small figure perched on the low brick wall bordering the hospital's parking lot. The same boy. The boy from yesterday, with eyes too old for his face and a quiet intensity that unsettled Jonathan. He dismissed him then as just another curious child, drawn to the spectacle of Isa's chair. But now, seeing him again, a prickle of unease crawled up his spine. Was he waiting for them? Jonathan slowed his pace, his hand tightening on the chair's handles. Isa, seemingly oblivious to the boy's presence, continued to stare straight ahead, her gaze fixed on some distant, unseen point. He considered turning back, retreating into the sterile safety of the hospital, but something held him back. A morbid curiosity, perhaps, or maybe a sliver of that desperate hope he'd tried so hard to extinguish. The boy slid off the wall, landing lightly on his feet. He approached them with a hesitant gait, his small hands fidgeting at his sides. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze shifting between Jonathan and Isa. Jonathan could feel his daughter tense beside him, her small body shrinking further into the chair. "You're back," the boy said, his voice soft, barely a whisper against the backdrop of the city's hum. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "We're leaving," he replied curtly, the words clipped, betraying the unease that churned within him. This child, with his unwavering stare and unsettling quietude, felt like an intrusion, a violation of the fragile bubble of grief he'd constructed around himself and Isa. "I can help her," the boy insisted, his voice gaining a fraction of strength, his eyes locking onto Jonathan's with an unnerving intensity. He swallowed, the small movement visible in the thin column of his neck. "I know I can." Jonathan scoffed, a harsh, bitter sound. He'd heard it all before. The well-meaning platitudes, the empty promises, the thinly veiled pity in the eyes of strangers. He wasn't about to entertain the fantasies of a child, no matter how earnest he seemed. "You don't understand," Jonathan said, his voice laced with weary resignation. "Don't you understand that this is my reality now? This wheelchair, these lifeless legs, this endless despair?" He didn't voice the thoughts, but they hung heavy in the air between them, a suffocating cloud of grief and frustration. The boy didn't flinch. "Just 1 hour," he said, his voice unwavering despite the tremor in his hands. "Let me show you." Jonathan stared at him, a mixture of disbelief and anger swirling within him. 1 hour. What could 1 hour possibly change? It was a ludicrous proposition, an insult to the months of agonizing therapy, the countless sleepless nights, the relentless erosion of hope. Yet, beneath the anger, a flicker of something else ignited. A desperate, irrational spark of what? Curiosity? Hope? He couldn't name it, but it was there, a tiny ember in the vast darkness of his despair. He looked at Isa, her small face pale and withdrawn. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the subtle tightening of her lips. He knew she was listening, absorbing every word, every nuance of this strange exchange. He knew she, too, was clinging to the last vestiges of hope, even though she rarely voiced it. For her, he thought. For that tiny, fragile ember. "Fine," he said, the word escaping his lips before he could fully process the decision. His voice sounded rough, unfamiliar even to his own ears. "Meet us at Harrington Park tomorrow noon." The boy's face broke into a small, hesitant smile. It was a fragile smile, tinged with a sadness that mirrored Jonathan's own. "I'll be there," he whispered, then turned and walked away, his small figure disappearing quickly into the afternoon crowd. Jonathan watched him go, a strange mix of regret and anticipation churning in his stomach. He had no logical reason to trust this boy, no tangible evidence to support his claims. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just agreed to something significant, something that could potentially alter the course of their lives, for better or for worse. He pushed Isa's chair towards the parking lot, the squeak of the wheels now carrying a different weight, a weight tinged with a fragile, uncertain hope. The sun, still heavy in the sky, seemed to cast longer shadows now, shadows that stretched towards an unknown future, a future that suddenly felt a little less bleak, a little less defined. 1 hour, he thought, the words a silent echo in the vast chambers of his heart. Just 1 hour. And in that single hour, he knew everything could change. The crisp air of a Birmingham noon held a deceptive chill, the kind that seeped into Jonathan's bones, settling alongside the ever-present ache of his grief. Harrington Park, usually a vibrant splash of color and laughter, felt muted, its usual symphony of Sunday picnics and children's games strangely subdued in his perception. He watched Isa, perched precariously on the edge of the park bench, her small hands gripping the wooden slats, her gaze fixed on the ground. 6 years old, and the world already felt too heavy for her slight frame. Jonathan's heart constricted, a familiar pang of helplessness. He'd promised her ice cream, a carousel ride, anything to coax a smile, yet the shadow of the accident lingered, a palpable presence between them. Then Zeke arrived, a whirlwind of unexpected energy in worn sneakers and a too-large jacket. He carried a small, faded duffel bag, its contents clinking softly with each step. Jonathan felt a flicker of irritation. This child, with his earnest eyes and outlandish claims, was his last resort. Hope had become a bitter pill, difficult to swallow. Zeke, seemingly oblivious to Jonathan's internal turmoil, unzipped the bag, revealing an assortment of simple tools, soft cloths, small rollers, a bottle of what looked like ordinary massage oil. "We'll start slow," Zeke said, his voice surprisingly calm for a 9-year-old. He glanced at Isa, a flicker of something Jonathan couldn't quite decipher in his eyes. Compassion? Understanding? Jonathan pushed the thought away. It was absurd. What could this boy possibly understand? "My mama used to help people walk again," Zeke said, as if reading Jonathan's thoughts. His small hands moved with surprising deftness, gently unwinding the thin blanket tucked around Isa's legs. She said the body remembers things, even when it forgets for a while. Jonathan scoffed internally. Remembered? Isa's body remembered paralysis. It was a cruel joke, a twisted mockery of hope. Yet, he remained silent, a strange blend of skepticism and morbid curiosity keeping him rooted to the spot. He watched Zeke's hands, small but strong, begin to work on Isa's legs, starting with slow, gentle stretches. Isa flinched at the first touch, her body stiffening. Jonathan's hand instinctively reached out, hovering protectively near her shoulder. He saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear that haunted his own dreams. He wanted to pull her away, to shield her from the charade. "It's okay, Isa," Zeke murmured, his voice soft, almost hypnotic. "It might feel a little strange at first. Just breathe." Jonathan was startled by the boy's gentle authority. He himself hadn't been able to soothe Isa like this in months. He watched, transfixed, as Zeke continued, his touch firm but gentle, his movements rhythmic and precise. He spoke to Isa softly, asking about her favorite colors, her favorite animals, distracting her from the discomfort, weaving a delicate web of normalcy around the unfamiliar sensations. Days turned into weeks, the Sunday sessions in Harrington Park becoming a strange ritual. Jonathan's skepticism remained, a heavy cloak of doubt he couldn't seem to shed. Yet beneath that doubt, a fragile seed of hope began to take root. He saw the subtle changes in Isa. The initial flinching gave way to a tentative relaxation. The quiet withdrawal began to melt, replaced by hesitant smiles and soft giggles as Zeke coaxed her into simple exercises, turning stretches into games, whispering stories as he worked. One particularly bright Sunday, as Zeke was helping Isa with a new stretching exercise, a flicker of movement, barely perceptible, rippled through her leg. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, convinced it was a trick of the light, a figment of his desperate hope. But then it happened again, a tiny twitch, a muscle contracting. He stared at Isa, his heart pounding against his ribs. He saw in her eyes, too, a spark of surprise, a flicker of something he hadn't seen in months' hope. It was as if a dormant ember within her had suddenly reignited, a fragile flame in the darkness. "Did you feel that, Daddy?" Isa whispered, her voice trembling. Jonathan couldn't speak. He could only nod, his eyes blurring with unshed tears. He looked at Zeke, who met his gaze with a quiet intensity. There was no triumph in the boy's expression, only a deep, unwavering focus. It was as if he had simply expected this, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. In the following weeks, the subtle movements became more pronounced. Isa, spurred by the first glimmers of progress, began to engage more actively in the sessions. The park, once a symbol of his loss, slowly transformed into a place of tentative hope, a sanctuary where the impossible seemed to be taking root. He watched the bond grow between Isa and Zeke, a silent understanding passing between them, a shared vulnerability that transcended words. He saw Zeke's own quiet resilience, the strength hidden beneath his youthful exterior, and he realized that perhaps, just perhaps, this unlikely encounter wasn't just about Isa's healing. It was about his own as well. The crisp Birmingham air no longer felt as cold. The weight on his chest had begun to lift, replaced by a tentative lightness, a fragile whisper of hope in the gathering dusk. The carousel music, once a painful reminder of lost joy, now carried a hint of promise, a melody of healing echoing through the park. The crisp autumn air nipped at Jonathan's cheeks as he pushed Isa's wheelchair towards the familiar bench at Harrington Park. Sundays had become a ritual, a pilgrimage to this unlikely altar of hope. The first Sunday, he'd come with a cynicism so thick it coated his tongue, a bitter aftertaste of disappointment from countless failed therapies. Now, a flicker of something akin to anticipation, fragile and hesitant, warmed his chest. He glanced down at Isa, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her usual withdrawn expression seemed to have softened, a subtle shift he couldn't quite decipher, but that resonated with a desperate hope within him. Was it possible? Was there truly something different happening here? He'd seen improvement, small, incremental, but undeniable. The way she held herself, the flicker of strength in her eyes when Zeke spoke to her. It wasn't enough to convince him fully, not yet, but enough to keep him coming back. Ezekiel, or Zeke as he insisted, was already there, his slight frame perched on the edge of the fountain, tossing pebbles into the water. He didn't look up, yet Jonathan felt the boy's awareness, that uncanny sense of knowing that unnerved him. The way Zeke moved, the way he spoke, the intensity in his young eyes, it was unsettling, almost otherworldly. He reminded Jonathan of an old soul trapped in a child's body. Jonathan parked Isa's chair beside the fountain, the metallic click echoing in the stillness of the morning. "We're here," he announced, his voice a little rougher than he intended. Zeke finally looked up, his gaze direct and unervingly perceptive. "Good," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We'll start with the breathing exercises." He didn't elaborate, didn't explain his methods. It was like he expected them to understand, to trust without question. Jonathan's skepticism bristled. He wanted explanations, scientific proof, anything tangible to grasp onto in this sea of uncertainty. But Isa, to his surprise, complied without a word. She closed her eyes, her small chest rising and falling with each slow, deliberate breath Zeke guided her through. Jonathan watched, the knot in his stomach tightening. It looked so simple, souseless. Yet, he couldn't deny the change in Isa's demeanor. A calmness settled over her features, a subtle relaxation he hadn't seen since before the accident. Over the next few Sundays, the routine continued. Zeke's methods were unconventional, a blend of breathing exercises, gentle manipulation, and whispered encouragements. Jonathan couldn't understand it, couldn't reconcile the boy's seemingly simple techniques with the gradual but visible changes in Isa. She started to feel sensation in her legs, a tingling warmth she described with wide, hesitant eyes. Her core strength improved, allowing her to sit upright for longer periods without support. He participated more actively, following Zeke's instructions with a growing, albeit reluctant, belief. Hope, a dangerous, almost forgotten emotion, began to take root in the barren landscape of his grief. One Sunday, as Jonathan watched Zeke guide Isa through a series of leg movements, a small crowd began to gather. Other families, drawn by whispers and rumors, arrived with children facing similar challenges. A woman with tear-filled eyes approached Jonathan, her voice trembling with a desperate plea. "They say he can help." Jonathan looked at the woman, her face etched with the same weariness and desperation he knew so well. He wanted to tell her to be cautious, to temper her expectations, but then he looked at Isa, sitting straighter than he'd ever seen her, a faint smile playing on her lips as Zeke whispered words of encouragement. He swallowed, the words of caution, the burgeoning hope within him whispering against his cynicism. "He's been helping Isa," he said, the words heavy with unspoken meaning. "We're still trying, but—" He trailed off, unable to articulate the fragile tendrils of hope that were slowly entwining around his heart. Then one Sunday it happened. The air was crisp, the leaves turning vibrant shades of gold and red. Zeke, as always, worked patiently with Isa, his small hands guiding her legs through a series of movements. Jonathan watched, his breath caught in his throat, a strange premonition settling over him. He saw Isa's face tighten with concentration, a flicker of determination in her eyes. And then she stood. Not fully, not steadily, but she stood. For a fleeting moment, her small legs supported her weight, her hands gripping Zeke's arms for balance. A gasp escaped Jonathan's lips, the sound raw and choked with emotion. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to this single, breathtaking moment. Then, just as quickly, Isa's legs buckled, and she collapsed back in her chair, but the image of her standing, however briefly, was seared into Jonathan's memory. He rushed forward, his heart pounding against his ribs, a mixture of disbelief and elation surging through him. He knelt beside Isa, his hands trembling as he cupped her face. You stood, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Isa looked at him, her eyes wide and shining with a new-found light. A small smile touched her lips. I did, she whispered back. Zeke stood beside them, his expression calm and composed, as if this miracle was simply another Sunday in the park. Jonathan turned to him, the skepticism that had clung to him for so long finally shattering. She stood, he repeated, the words a statement of fact, a testament to the impossible. Zeke met his gaze, his eyes holding a wisdom far beyond his years. I said we'd try, he replied, his voice soft but firm, a quiet echo of the unwavering hope that had brought them to this extraordinary moment. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the living room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Jonathan watched Zeke, small and focused, manipulating Isa's leg with a strange, gentle firmness. It had been weeks since their first encounter in the park, weeks of an unsettling blend of disbelief and fragile hope. Isa's leg, once limp and unresponsive, now twitched, a flicker of life in a landscape of despair. He'd seen it with his own eyes, felt the tremor beneath his own touch, a tremor that echoed not only in her muscles, but in the hollow caverns of his own chest. Is this real? He thought, the question a constant thrumming in his mind. Can this boy, this child, truly be the answer? The weight of his skepticism, once a heavy cloak, began to fray at the edges, replaced by a tentative, almost desperate embrace of possibility. Better, Zeke asked, his voice a soft whisper, his gaze fixed on Isa's face. Isa, usually so withdrawn, offered a small nod, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. Jonathan felt a lump forming in his throat. He swallowed hard, the sound loud in the quiet room. He hadn't seen her smile like that in months, not since he pushed the thought away, the familiar pang of grief, a dull ache in his chest. Much better, Isa murmured, her voice barely audible. That night, over a dinner of reheated lasagna, Jonathan broached the subject that had been weighing heavily on his mind. He watched Zeke meticulously dissecting his food, the boy's small hands surprisingly deft with the cutlery. Zeke, he began, his voice unsteady, I was wondering if you'd consider staying with us. Here with Isa and me. Zeke paused, his fork hovering midair. He looked up, his dark eyes unreadable. Jonathan held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Okay, Zeke finally said, his voice quiet but firm. He resumed eating, as if the decision to uproot his life and move in with a virtual stranger was the most mundane thing in the world. Jonathan released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief washed over him, a tide pulling him away from the jagged rocks of despair. Maybe, just maybe, things are starting to turn around, he thought, the flicker of hope growing stronger. The days that followed blurred into a routine of therapy, laughter, and a slowly building sense of normalcy. Zeke's presence became a constant, a quiet hum in the background of their lives. He was there at breakfast, his small hands carefully pouring Isa's milk. He was there during her therapy sessions, his unwavering gaze fixed on her every movement. He was there at night, reading stories to her, his voice a soothing balm against the shadows. And with each passing day, Isa grew stronger. She could sit up longer, her legs holding her weight with increasing stability. She could even take a few tentative steps, her small hand gripping Zeke's with fierce determination. The transformation wasn't confined to the walls of their home. Word of Isa's progress spread like wildfire. Other families, their hopes as fragile as Jonathan's had been, began to appear in the park. They watched Zeke with a mixture of awe and skepticism, their eyes mirroring the initial doubt that had gnawed at Jonathan's own soul. But as they witnessed the small miracles unfolding before them, Their doubt, too, began to dissolve. The park, once a place of quiet solitude, became a haven of healing, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Children, their limbs once bound by paralysis, now ran and played, their laughter echoing through the trees. Parents, their faces etched with years of worry, now smiled, their eyes shining with renewed hope. Jonathan watched it all, a profound sense of gratitude swelling in his chest. He found himself thinking less about ISA's recovery and more about the ripple effect Zeke's presence had created, the way he'd touched so many lives, including his own. One cool evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in a warm, golden glow, Jonathan sat beside Zeke on a park bench, watching the children play. "You're going to change a lot of lives, Zeke," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. Zeke looked at him, his dark eyes reflecting the dying embers of the sunset. "I already am," he replied, his voice soft, yet filled with a quiet conviction that belied his age. Jonathan looked at the boy, truly looked at him, and saw not just a child, but a force of nature, a beacon of hope in a world often shrouded in darkness. A wave of emotion washed over him, a mixture of awe, gratitude, and a profound sense of responsibility. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that their lives were irrevocably intertwined, their paths converging towards a destination neither of them could have foreseen. He knew, too, that the healing Zeke brought wasn't just about restoring physical function. It was about mending broken spirits, about rekindling hope in the face of despair. It was about reminding them all that even in the darkest of times, even in the face of unimaginable loss, there was still the possibility of light, of healing, of a future yet unwritten. And in that moment, surrounded by the echoes of laughter and the whispers of hope, Jonathan finally understood that the miracle wasn't just ISA walking again. It was the way Zeke had brought them all back to life. The ninth Sunday at Harrington Park dawned crisp and clear, the early autumn air holding a hint of wood smoke and the sweet decay of fallen leaves. The usual scattering of dog walkers and Tai Chi practitioners had swelled into a veritable crowd. A low hum of anticipation vibrated through the gathered onlookers, their eyes drawn to the familiar patch of grass where, for weeks, a small, silent drama had unfolded. Jonathan felt the pressure of their gaze like a physical weight, settling heavy in his chest. He glanced at ISA, strapped in her lightweight brace, her small hands gripping the handles. Her face, usually pale and withdrawn, held a flicker of something akin to excitement, a fragile flame in the vast emptiness of his own despair. He swallowed, the knot in his throat constricting his breath. Could this really be happening? Could this boy, this strange, quiet child with his unsettlingly knowing eyes, truly offer what doctors and therapists had dismissed as impossible? Zeke, as always, was a study in stillness. He stood beside ISA, his small frame radiating an almost preternatural calm. Jonathan had watched him over the past weeks, watched the meticulous way he worked with ISA, the gentle pressure of his hands, the quiet murmur of his voice, a language of touch and whispered encouragement that seemed to bypass ISA's conscious mind and speak directly to her damaged nerves. He'd seen the flicker of doubt in the boy's eyes, the fleeting moments of frustration masked by a stoicism that seemed far too old for his 9 years. And he'd felt the insidious creep of hope, a dangerous emotion he'd buried deep after the accident, begin to claw its way back to the surface. The air crackled with unspoken expectation. A robin perched on a nearby branch. It sung a thin thread of melody against the backdrop of rustling leaves and hushed whispers. Zeke knelt beside ISA, his hand resting lightly on her back. "Ready?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the gentle breeze. ISA nodded, her eyes fixed on the ground in front of her. Jonathan felt a tremor run through him, a mixture of fear and a desperate yearning he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge until this moment. He wanted to believe, he needed to believe, but the fear of disappointment, of shattering ISA's fragile hope, was a suffocating presence. Zeke, with a subtle shift of his weight, signaled to ISA. She took a deep breath, her small chest rising and falling beneath her thin sweater. Then, with a visible effort, she pushed herself up, her legs trembling beneath her. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Jonathan held his breath, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He wanted to reach out, to steady her, but something held him back. He needed to see this, needed to witness this impossible moment unfold without his interference. ISA stood, swaying slightly, her hands still gripping the handles of the brace. Her eyes, wide and luminous, met his. He saw a flicker of surprise, of disbelief, mirrored in his own stunned expression. Time seemed to stretch, to distort, each second an eternity. The only sound was the whisper of the wind through the trees and the frantic thumping of his own heart. Then, with a hesitant step, she moved forward. Another step, and another. The crowd erupted in applause, a wave of sound that washed over Jonathan, leaving him feeling strangely detached, as though he were observing the scene from a great distance. "I'm standing," ISA whispered, her voice trembling with wonder. The words, so simple, so profound, pierced the fog of his grief like a shaft of sunlight. He knelt beside her, his eyes blurring with tears he hadn't shed in months. "Yeah," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "You are." He reached out, his hand hovering over her arm, afraid to touch her, afraid to break the spell. He felt a strange mix of elation and terror, the joy of witnessing this miracle warring with the fear that it was all a dream, a cruel illusion that would vanish as quickly as it had appeared. Zeke stepped back, his face unreadable. He avoided the gazes of the crowd, his eyes fixed on the ground. Jonathan noticed a slight tremor in his hands, the only outward sign of the immense pressure he must have been carrying. He wanted to thank him, to express the overwhelming gratitude that swelled in his chest, but the words seemed inadequate, trivial in the face of this extraordinary act. The crowd pressed closer, their voices a cacophony of congratulations and questions. Jonathan shielded ISA with his body, a primal instinct to protect her from the overwhelming attention. He saw Zeke slip away, melting into the crowd like a ghost. He wanted to call him back, to acknowledge his presence, his gift, but the words caught in his throat. He watched him disappear, a small, solitary figure swallowed by the throng, and felt a pang of something akin to loss. He knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic or reason, that this was just the beginning, that this strange, quiet boy had not only helped ISA walk again, but had also, in some inexplicable way, begun to mend the shattered pieces of his own broken heart. The journey was far from over, but for the first time since the accident, Jonathan felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile seed of possibility taking root in the barren landscape of his grief. The world, once a desolate wasteland of pain and despair, had suddenly begun to bloom with color again. The scent of rosemary and garlic clung to the air, a familiar comfort in the Reeves kitchen. Tonight, however, it felt different, less like a bomb, more like an echo of a life that was a life before the accident, before the hushed whispers and the stifled sobs, before the wheelchair became a permanent fixture in their home. Jonathan watched Zeke from across the table, the boy's small hands meticulously arranging carrot sticks into a lopsided pyramid. He'd initially seen Zeke as a distraction, a fleeting curiosity in the bleak landscape of their lives. Now, looking at him, Jonathan felt a pang of something akin to awe. This child, barely old enough to understand the complexities of the world, had somehow managed to breach the fortress of his grief, a fortress he hadn't even realized he'd built. Zeke's brow furrowed in concentration, his tongue peeking out from the corner of his mouth. He'd been coming over for weeks now, working with ISA, patiently coaxing movement back in her legs. The progress was slow, agonizingly slow, but undeniable. A twitch here, a flicker of muscle there, tiny victories that resonated with the force of an earthquake in the desolate terrain of their despair. Jonathan remembered the initial skepticism, the cold, hard logic that screamed against the possibility of a 9-year-old boy performing miracles. He had seen specialists, therapists, experts from around the country. They all offered the same prognosis of life, confined to a wheelchair. And yet, here he was, watching his daughter, his ISA, take tentative steps, her small hand gripping Zeke's with fierce determination. He pushed his plate away, the food tasteless, his appetite long gone. He wasn't hungry for food. He was hungry for something else, something he couldn't quite name. Hope, perhaps. A dangerous word, a fragile thing that he'd buried deep within himself. He'd become accustomed to the dull ache of acceptance, the weight of it a familiar burden. Zeke, in his quiet, unassuming way, had chipped away at that burden, stone by stone, until a sliver of light had begun to seep through. "Dinner's good, Mr. Reeves," Zeke said, his voice pulling Jonathan from his thoughts. He looked up, a small smile playing on his lips. "Your rosemary chicken is the best." "Thank you, Zeke," Jonathan replied, the words catching in his throat. He cleared his throat, trying to find the right words, the words that could express the enormity of what this boy had done for them. You've changed everything." Zeke met his gaze, his eyes, usually bright and playful, held a depth that belied his age. "I did," he simply said. There was no boastfulness in his tone, merely a quiet acknowledgement of the truth. Jonathan watched as Zeke finished his carrots, carefully placing the last one on top of the pyramid. He remembered the first time he'd met Zeke, the boy's small frame almost swallowed by the oversized hoodie he wore. He'd seemed lost, adrift, a ghost haunting the edges of the park where ISA used to play. He'd learned later about Zeke's mother, a physical therapist who had dedicated her life to helping others, a woman who had instilled in her son a unique gift and a profound sense of empathy. She had passed away just a few months before ISA's accident, leaving Zeke alone, adrift in a world that suddenly seemed too large, too harsh. Jonathan suddenly understood. Zeke wasn't just helping ISA. He was helping himself. He was carrying on his mother's legacy, finding solace in the act of healing others. He was mending his own broken heart by stitching together the broken hearts of others. The realization struck Jonathan with the force of a physical blow. Sometimes the most broken people are the ones holding the tools to help others heal, he thought, the words echoing in his mind. Sometimes, Jonathan said aloud, his voice husky with emotion, sometimes the most broken people, he trailed off, unable to articulate the thought fully. Zeke looked at him, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He didn't need words. He understood. Later that evening, after Zeke had gone home, Jonathan sat by ISA's bedside, watching her sleep. The faint glow of the moon painted her face in a soft light. He reached out and gently touched her hand, marveling at the warmth of her skin, the steady rhythm of her breath. He thought of the park, the small group of people who had gathered there, drawn by Zeke's quiet presence, each carrying their own burdens, their own stories of pain and loss. It had started with just ISA and Zeke, two broken souls seeking solace in each other's company. Now, it was a community, a testament to the enduring power of hope, a sanctuary for the wounded. Jonathan closed his eyes, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. It wasn't the exhaustion of despair, but the exhaustion of healing, the kind that comes after a long and arduous journey. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months, a quiet certainty that, despite the darkness, there was still light, still hope, still the possibility of a new beginning. He opened his eyes and looked at ISA again, her face serene in sleep. He knew the road ahead would still be long and challenging. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. He had found something he thought he'd lost forever. He had found hope. And in that hope, he found the strength to keep going, to keep fighting, to keep believing in the possibility of miracles.